My boss made one mistake that day. He thought shredding my contract meant shredding my value. I stood there in his office watching the strips fall into the bin like confetti at a celebration I wasn't invited to. He actually smiled while he did it, leaning back in his leather chair, telling me I should focus on being grateful to even have a job. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the contract he destroyed was the only thing standing between him and a storm that had been building for years. For 3 years I'd been the lead engineer behind the company's automation line, the heartbeat of their entire production system. I designed every module, rewrote legacy infrastructure, and built a library of proprietary algorithms so efficient that 3 competitors tried to poach me within months. Through all of it, I stayed loyal. Loyal because of the contract that protected my rights to my work and guaranteed bonuses tied to performance milestones. Loyal because I believed the company valued my contribution. But as the quarters passed and our profits grew, my bonuses got delayed, my requests for updated terms got ignored, and somehow my boss always had time for a vacation but never time for my compensation review. Things finally hit a boiling point when I confronted him in a boardroom after yet another quarter of record-breaking numbers. I asked, calmly, for the bonus that had been delayed for the 4th time. He looked at me with that condescending smirk he reserved for people he thought he had power over. "If you're unhappy," he said, "you're welcome to leave. But you won't be taking anything with you." Then he reached into the folder on the table, pulled out the original copy of my contract, the one my lawyer had insisted we both sign, and fed it into the shredder while maintaining eye contact. Strip by strip, my protections disappeared, or so he thought. I walked out of his office without another word, went straight to my car, and drove home with my head spinning. Anger, disbelief, humiliation, it all hit at once. But under it, beneath the noise, something else stirred. A question. A dangerous one. What exactly did he think he'd destroyed? Because unknown to him, that contract wasn't the only copy. More importantly, every single patent tied to my automation systems, 41 in total, had been registered under my name as the primary inventor. Not the company's. Mine. The contract he shredded only governed licensing terms. And without it, the company suddenly had no legal right to use any of my technology. The next morning, I visited my attorney and handed her the digital copies, the timestamps, the email chain, the notarized records, everything my boss assumed didn't exist. She didn't stop smiling the entire meeting. "He shredded his own license," she said. "This is going to be fun." Within 48 hours, a formal cease and desist request was drafted and delivered to the company. A legal freeze was placed on every system component using my patents. Production halted instantly. Trucks sat idle at loading docks. Client shipments missed deadlines. The board demanded answers. My former boss tried to spin a story about rogue employees and miscommunication, but nothing he said mattered, not when my lawyer produced the registration records proving I held full ownership of the intellectual property. The board's attorneys realized the scale of the damage within minutes. 41 patents formed the backbone of the company's competitive advantage. Without them, their operations reverted to pre-automation levels, slow, expensive, and impossible to scale. Competitors smelled blood. Investors panicked. Stockholders demanded emergency meetings. 3 days later, I was invited, politely, to meet with the board. They asked if there was a path forward. There was. Just not for him. When I arrived at the headquarters, they escorted me past employees staring nervously at frozen assembly lines and blank monitors. The boardroom was silent when I entered, but at the far end of the table, my old boss sat pale and sweating, finally understanding what he'd done. The board chairman cleared his throat and asked if I'd consider reinstating the licenses. I told them I would, at the correct valuation, with back pay, and with full acknowledgement of inventor rights. They agreed almost instantly. They even asked if I'd return as head of R&D. But I looked at my former boss, still avoiding my eyes like a kid caught breaking his own toy, and I knew my answer. I declined. Instead, I sold exclusive limited-term licenses to 3 competitors, companies who treated engineers like assets, not tools. For the first time in my career, I earned what my work was actually worth. My patents built entire product lines, created new divisions, and reshaped an industry. As for my old company, the board fired my boss the same day. They tried to recover, but losing their only differentiating technology cost them their largest clients. Revenues dipped, then plummeted. They never went out of business, but they became irrelevant, a footnote in an industry they once dominated. Years later, my former boss still tells people I blindsided him. But the truth is simple, he shredded my contract thinking he was ending my rights. What he destroyed was his own protection, the only thing keeping 41 patents from snapping back like a loaded spring. And when they did, his company never recovered. He didn't realize the full weight of what he'd done until the legal clock ran out. When the licensing freeze hit day 7, the company's emergency reserves were already draining. Their biggest client, one that accounted for nearly 38% of annual revenue, sent a notice of breach. Another issued a warning that they were preparing to terminate their supply contract and sue for damages. Without my automation algorithms, production capacity dropped by nearly 70%. Costs skyrocketed. Shipment delays multiplied. And internally, engineers scrambled to reverse engineer the systems I'd spent years perfecting, only to discover that the architecture was locked down with proprietary encryption linked directly to my inventor certificates. In other words, they couldn't even copy my work illegally. By day 10, my old boss was no longer pretending he had control. He sat in his office surrounded by half-packed boxes, taking calls from board members who had once praised him but were now demanding explanations he didn't have. The funny thing? All he had to do was treat me fairly. One conversation, one honest negotiation, 1 ounce of respect, and I would have stayed. Instead, he swung the axe at the one person holding the structure together, and then acted shocked when the whole thing collapsed. Around this time, I got a call from one of the senior engineers who stayed behind. Not to beg, not to guilt trip, not to manipulate. Just to tell me the truth. She said the atmosphere in the building felt like the last 5 minutes before a plane crash. Everyone knew the impact was coming, and no one could stop it. She said my old boss had gone from arrogant to frantic to silent within a week. He keeps blaming you, she said. I laughed. Of course he does. But everyone else blames him, she added quietly. Day 12 is when the board made their final move. They summoned him to an emergency meeting, no lawyers, no advisors, no theatrics. The CEO himself, a man who rarely showed emotion, placed a folder in front of him and said the 3 words that ended his career, "You're being removed." He tried arguing. Tried spinning. Tried claiming I had betrayed the company. But the board had already seen all the documentation, the contracts, the shredded pages, the emails proving he delayed my bonuses on purpose to make me desperate. They saw how he violated policy, ignored counsel, and recklessly destroyed legal agreements without understanding what they protected. He wasn't just fired. He was banned from stepping foot in the building. One director told me privately later, "We've never seen someone take down a company with so much quiet precision." But here's the twist. I didn't celebrate. I didn't dance on the ashes. I didn't brag or gloat or send messages rubbing it in. Because the truth is, I didn't have to. Consequences speak louder than revenge. And the consequences were just beginning. Under their new licensing agreement with my competitors, those companies surged, expanding product lines, lowering costs, winning long-term contracts the old company had counted on for years. My patents became standard in 3 new industries. Engineers studied them. Executives praised them. Analysts wrote papers about them. And while my former employer kept shrinking, I kept growing. 6 months later, I stood on a stage accepting an innovation award for contributions to industrial automation. Cameras flashed, applause filled the room, and after the ceremony, a line of executives approached me with offers, consulting, partnerships, speaking engagements. I noticed someone standing near the back, watching quietly. It was my former boss. Older. Smaller. Deflated in a way arrogance can't recover from. Our eyes met for a second. Not in anger. Not in fear. Just recognition. He realized something in that moment, something he should have understood the day he fed my contract into the shredder. You can fire an engineer. You can shred their paperwork. You can underestimate their worth. But you cannot erase the mind that built the future you depend on. He created his own downfall. I simply reclaimed what was mine. He lingered there a moment longer, as if trying to decide whether to approach me. Maybe he wanted to apologize. Maybe he wanted to justify himself. Or maybe he was just hoping for a shred of validation, some sign that his downfall hadn't been entirely his fault. But I turned away. Not out of spite, but because the chapter was already closed. I had no interest in reopening a story he'd ruined with his own hands. After the award ceremony, a journalist pulled me aside for an interview. She asked what drove me to keep pushing forward after everything that had happened, the sabotage, the betrayal, the disrespect. I told her the truth, simple and unpolished. People think revenge is about destroying someone else. It's not. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself they tried to break. She nodded, but I don't think she fully understood. Because my revenge wasn't a grand explosion or a dramatic showdown. It wasn't fire or fury or chaos. It was clarity. It was walking away from the people who never deserved my talent. It was building something they could never again touch. And as I left the building, award in hand, I felt the weight of the past finally lift. Not because I'd won and he'd lost, but because I'd finally realized how small his world had always been, and how much bigger mine could become when I stopped letting him define it. Years later, whenever someone asks me about that chapter of my life, I don't talk about the shredded contract or the lawsuit or the collapse of the company. I tell them something else. Never fight to stay where you aren't valued. Your talent is a seed, plant it where it can grow. And that's the real ending. Not destruction. Not vengeance. Growth. The kind of ending that becomes a beginning. I walked out of that interview into the cool evening air, and for the first time in years, I wasn't walking away from something, I was walking towards something better. The old company, the old boss, the old battles, they were finally behind me. But the world ahead felt wide open, almost unfamiliar in how full of possibility it suddenly was. What surprised me most wasn't the victory or the recognition. It was how quickly life started aligning the moment I stopped pouring myself into a place that hollowed me out. Investors who once brushed off my ideas were now asking for meetings. Former colleagues, good ones, were reaching out to collaborate. And the patents I reclaimed? They weren't just trophies. They became the backbone of a new venture, one built on integrity instead of ego. And here's the part people never expect. I wasn't angry anymore. Revenge stories usually end with someone laughing over their enemy's ashes. But for me, peace came from something quieter, not triumph, but release. I realized that my boss hadn't ruined anything. If anything, he'd accelerated a transformation I'd been resisting out of loyalty, fear, habit, maybe all three. Sometimes you have to be pushed out so you finally stop living small. A year later, my old boss sent a request on LinkedIn. I didn't accept it. Not out of bitterness, just because I didn't need anything from that part of my life anymore. Success had taken me far past the point where his opinion mattered. And in the end, the real revenge wasn't the patents, the collapse of his company, or the recognition I gained after. It was the fact that I didn't spend a single second trying to destroy him. I simply built something better. He just happened to be standing in the shadow of it. That's the kind of justice life delivers quietly, cleanly, when you finally choose your own worth over someone else's limitation. And that's where the story truly ends. Not with his downfall, but with my rise. In the months that followed, my world didn't just change, it expanded. Every day felt like I was rediscovering pieces of myself I'd shelved during those years of carrying someone else's company on my back. The patents, my patents, turned into prototypes, the prototypes into early partnerships, and those partnerships into a pipeline that made investors perk up before I even finished my pitch deck. The new venture grew fast, but not chaotically. I built it intentionally, pulling in the people who'd always worked quietly and skillfully in the background, the ones who'd been overlooked or underpaid because they weren't loud enough for the old leadership's taste. I didn't have to convince them to join. They came because they remembered the way I treated them when no one was watching. Turns out, good leadership has a long shelf life. Meanwhile, word trickled in about my former boss. Apparently, the implosion from losing the patents had spread faster than he could control. His board grew restless. Clients grew suspicious. And regulators, well, they were suddenly very interested in his record-keeping practices. But I didn't celebrate any of it. Honestly, it felt distant, like hearing drama from a town you moved away from years ago. I had new fires to build, not old ones to warm myself on. One morning, while sketching out ideas with my new team, I caught myself smiling, really smiling, in that effortless way I hadn't felt since before everything burned down. It hit me, the revenge had stopped being about proving him wrong and started being about proving myself right. I wasn't the employee he tried to shrink. I was the inventor, the architect, the mind behind the very ideas he thought he could bury. And every step forward made that truth louder. Eventually, analysts started writing about the unexpected newcomer disrupting the sector. They listed my old patents one by one, giving credit where it had always belonged. Some even mentioned how the previous company had mismanaged critical assets. Of course, they never said his name, but they didn't need to. Everyone in the industry could read between the lines. He had shredded my contract, thinking he was shredding my future. But all he did was tear his own company in half. And me? I was too busy building an empire out of the pieces he left behind. 6 months later, the industry summit rolled around, the same summit my old boss used to drag me to so he could parade my work around as if it were his own. This time, I walked in through a different entrance, not as someone's plus one, not as the guy behind the scenes, but as the featured keynote speaker. It wasn't lost on me how poetic that was. When I stepped on stage and looked out at the crowd, analysts, journalists, venture firms, engineers, executives, I felt something settle inside me. Not pride. Not revenge. Something quieter. Ownership. Finally, the room was full of people who knew exactly whose ideas they'd been benefiting from all these years. Midway through the Q&A, someone from the press asked a question that made the entire audience shift forward. Given your history with your former employer, do you have any comment on their recent collapse? A few people chuckled. A few others looked down, pretending not to wait for the answer. I took a slow breath, not to restrain myself, but to make sure I said exactly what needed to be said. It's simple, I replied. When leadership treats innovators like disposable parts, the company eventually breaks. You can't build a future on someone else's ideas while trying to erase the person who created them. The room fell completely still. Then the applause came, not polite applause, but a wave of agreement. People were tired of those old, ego-driven corporate machines. They wanted something better. After the event, investors swarmed. Former competitors approached me with respect they'd never shown before. And quietly, almost sheepishly, a few employees from my old company sought me out. They wanted a place on my growing team. Not because I was winning, but because they remembered the way I used to lead from the middle, not from the top. But the moment that stuck with me came weeks later. I was leaving my office when a security guard handed me a sealed envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sentence: "You built what I never could." No signature, but I knew exactly who wrote it. My old boss had disappeared from the company's public-facing roles after the board upheaval. Rumors said he'd been quietly forced out. Others claimed he was under investigation for the contract destruction. But none of that mattered. That one sentence said everything. He finally understood the truth he'd tried to bury. I folded the note, slipped it into my desk drawer, and went back to work. Because the real revenge wasn't the patents, the collapse, or the headlines. It was that my life had moved forward, and his had stopped exactly where he tried to stop mine. And as my company kept scaling, more hires, new labs, expanded contracts, I realized the most satisfying part of all of this: he had fired me to get rid of a problem. But in doing so, he set me free to become the one thing he feared most: an inventor with nothing holding him back. 2 months into our latest product release, I started to notice a pattern. Every major corporation that had once been loyal to my old company was now coming to us. Not because we were the shiny new option, but because word had gotten out about the truth behind those 41 patents. The industry had finally realized the engine of innovation hadn't been the company, it had been me. And now the engine had wheels of its own. One afternoon, during a quiet stretch between meetings, my assistant buzzed in. "There's a delegation here from Orion Industrial. They say it's urgent." Orion was one of the largest contractors my old company had ever worked with, the kind of client executives bragged about for years. I told her to send them in. 3 people walked into my office: a compliance director, a VP, and a man I recognized from old conference room battles, the kind of battles where I'd present a solution, and my boss would barge in to take credit. The VP placed a folder on my desk. "We want to transfer all our remaining projects to you." Completely. I raised an eyebrow. "That's sudden." "It's strategic," he said. "Your old company has been less than stable. Their submissions are chaotic. They can't meet deadlines. And now with the legal issues involving your patents, we'd rather cut ties cleanly." Legal issues. That was interesting. I played it cool. "Legal issues?" The compliance director cleared her throat. "The board claims your former COO misrepresented ownership of several invention lines. Investigators found shredded documentation in the CEO's office." Shredded documentation. Of course. The same stunt he pulled with my contract. "The board claims they're victims of fraud," she continued. "But the investigators aren't buying it." I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of their words settle. My former company wasn't just floundering, they were drowning. And this wasn't some petty collapse over poor management. This was structural failure. They'd built an empire on the idea that creators were replaceable, and now the entire structure was folding under the weight of that lie. "We'd like to begin the transition immediately," the VP said. "You have the original designs. You understand the systems. And frankly, we trust you more." Those last 4 words hit with surprising force. They trust you more. It wasn't just poetic revenge. It was validation on a level my old boss never allowed the world to see. I signed off on the partnership. By the time the delegation left, my company's valuation had quietly jumped by another $30 million. A few years earlier, that number felt impossible. Now it barely scratched the surface of what we were building. Later that night, as I locked up the office, I glanced at the drawer where I'd kept the anonymous note from my old boss. "You built what I never could." For the first time, I didn't feel anger. Not victory. Something closer to closure. He had tried to bury my work. He had tried to bury me. And yet here I was, still building, still rising, while everything he'd held together with ego and tape was collapsing behind him. It was the quiet truth of all corporate revenge stories, the one nobody likes to admit. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction. It's outgrowing the people who tried to shrink you. And I had outgrown him so completely that his downfall now felt like nothing more than a distant echo. A week later, I got a call I never expected. Not from a client. Not from an investor. From a federal investigator. "Mr. Hale, we'd like to ask a few questions regarding the patent dispute involving your former employer." I agreed, of course. I had nothing to hide. But the investigator's tone told me everything. This wasn't about me. This was about them. We met at a federal office downtown, sterile walls, quiet hallways, the kind of place where truth feels heavier. The investigator sat across from me with a thick file. "Your former company claimed full ownership of over 40 patents that trace back to you," he said. "We've reviewed your original filings. We've also seen what they destroyed." "What they shredded," I corrected softly. He nodded. "Yes. But fortunately, they weren't as thorough as they believed. Turns out the shredding machine they used had been malfunctioning. Half the documents were only partially destroyed. Forensics pieced together over 80% of the lost paperwork, including my original design logs, invention disclosures, and contract attachments." The investigator tapped the folder. "This is enough to indict several executives." I sat back, letting out a slow breath. I thought I'd feel triumphant. Vindicated. But instead, I felt tired. Not defeated, just aware of how much energy they'd drained from me all those years. "They built a culture around taking credit from people like you," he said. "It was always going to catch up eventually." When I left the building, the winter air felt a little sharper, a little cleaner. By Friday morning, the news broke. Tech Corp executives face federal charges in patent fraud scandal. The internet exploded. Old colleagues messaged me privately. Some apologized. Some begged for jobs. Some just wanted to say they always knew something was wrong. And then, almost poetic in timing, the final blow hit. The board removed the CEO. The COO resigned. Stockholders sued. Competitors poached what little talent remained. By month's end, my former company was circling the drain, kept alive only by lawyers in denial. Meanwhile, my own company, built with the same ideas they tried to steal, was thriving. We'd grown to nearly 200 employees, and for the first time in my career, I wasn't the one being overworked, overlooked, or undermined. I was the one creating the environment I once needed. One evening, as I was closing my laptop, my head of engineering stepped into my office. "You're on the cover," she said, tossing a magazine onto my desk. There it was, the quiet genius who reclaimed his future and reinvented an industry. My picture. My story. No stolen credit. No hidden contributions. No erased effort. Just truth. Finally. I picked up the magazine and realized something that surprised even me. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was rebirth. A door they tried to slam in my face had become the doorway to a future I never would have pursued otherwise. They didn't end my career, they redirected it somewhere better, bigger, and entirely my own. I looked out the window at the city lights and said it aloud just to hear the truth of it. They didn't break me. They freed me. 2 months later, I got an email that instantly brought back the old burn of fluorescent lights, broken promises, and stolen credit. It was from her, the boss who shredded my contract, who smiled as if my career was disposable, who never understood how deeply she underestimated me. Subject: request for meeting message. It's urgent. I almost deleted it. But curiosity has a sense of humor, and mine was laughing. We met in a quiet cafe far from downtown. She looked smaller than I remembered. Maybe it was the stress, maybe the lawsuits, maybe the reality that the world finally saw her without the carefully polished shield of corporate power. She sat across from me, hands trembling slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. "I need your help," she said. Not an apology. Not accountability. Just desperation. The company is collapsing. The patents you took back, without them, we've got nothing. Investors are pulling out. Partners won't return our calls. The board is, I stopped her gently. Not cruelly. Just finally in control. You shredded my contract, I said quietly. Remember? Her eyes flickered. Shame, regret, fear, maybe all three. Maybe none. I made a mistake, she murmured. You made a series of them, I corrected. And they weren't accidents. They were choices. She opened her mouth to respond, but the weight of the truth seemed to shut it again. Look, she said after a moment, you know the company better than anyone. If you came back, even temporarily, you could help stabilize everything. We'd compensate you. Fairly. That word, fairly, nearly made me laugh. I leaned back, studying her. For years she held absolute power over my livelihood. Now she sat here asking for mine. I'm not coming back, I said simply. A single tear slipped out of her eye, quiet, quick, almost embarrassed to be seen. I built that company, she whispered. I nodded. And then you burned it trying to kill the people who helped build it with you. She froze. I stood, slid my chair in, and placed my business card on the table, not as an olive branch, but as a reminder. A reminder that while she clung to a dying legacy, I had already moved on to build something alive. That's the difference between us, I said. You wanted ownership. I wanted impact. And impact lasts longer. I walked out before she could respond. Not triumphant. Not angry. Just done. In the parking lot, my phone buzzed. It was our biggest partner confirming a multi-year, multi-million-dollar expansion contract. My company, my real company, was growing faster than analysts predicted. My team was thriving. My ideas were respected. My work had purpose. I looked up at the evening sky and breathed in the cold air. My old boss had believed she ended my career. But all she really ended was her illusion of control. And as for me, the world she tried to keep me out of. I own my place in it now. In the months that followed, news about my former company spread like wildfire. Their stock plummeted. The board launched investigations. The CEO, my former boss, quietly stepped down for personal reasons. Everyone knew it wasn't personal. It was structural collapse, built on arrogance and the belief that people were disposable. The partners they once bragged about? They came knocking on my door instead. The innovations they tried to claim as their own? Now fully protected under my name. The contracts they once waved in my face? Rewritten under my terms. And the employees who used to whisper in hallways, terrified of retaliation. Many of them joined me, eager to work in a place where contribution mattered more than politics. My new company didn't just rise. It soared. Because it was built on trust, merit, and the understanding that people aren't tools you replace, they're engines that drive everything forward. Sometimes revenge is dramatic. Explosive. Loud. But the most devastating revenge? Is success so undeniable that the people who tried to sabotage you are forced to watch you thrive without them? And that's exactly what happened. My old boss destroyed my contract thinking she tore up my future. But all she really shredded was her own. I didn't just reclaim my patents, I reclaimed my worth, my freedom, and my power. In the end, she was left with a dying empire. And I walked away to build a kingdom.